this is the time to get deeper into what the other person is experiencing such that you can tailor your proposal and your service to that lead. So when we're talking about who's doing the majority of the talking, it's not you, my friends, it's the other person on the end of the Zoom screen or the phone line. Welcome back to another episode of the Seven Figure Educator Podcast. My name is Dr. Erica Jordan Thomas, and I am your host. I'm a former teacher, former principal, Harvard grad, and founder and CEO of EJT Education Group. During today's episode, we're going to dive into what is a discovery call, the biggest mistakes I see people making with discovery calls, and 5 best practices to help you improve your discovery call. So let's get into it. Let's first create some common language by actually clarifying what is a discovery call. So a discovery call is a part of your sales process, and it's typically the early stage of initiating a conversation with a lead that then leads them to potentially becoming a client. So this is a step in your sales process that's typically before either your proposal or before whatever is the step that converts a lead into a client. So when we're talking about discovery calls, whether you are a business to client model, which means that you are directly selling to individuals, or you are a B2B model, meaning business to business model, you're typically doing discovery calls. So let's jump into 5 mistakes that I see people making with their discovery calls, and then I'll share with you a best practice for each one so that way you know how to mitigate it. Let's talk about the first mistake. The first mistake that I see people making with their discovery calls is that they're assuming that the other person just knows who they are. Like they're taking for granted that the fact that the other person on the end of the line booked the call, so they must know who I am. They must know how dope I am. They must know that I'm an expert. And the reality is you're going to have to remind people who you are. So you want to be thoughtful that this discovery call, it's essentially a first date, right? Like you don't show up to a first date just assuming the other person knows you. Like you're going to have to show up to that space ready to actually tell people who you are. So when we're talking about this misstep of assuming that the other person knows who you are, the best practice here is that you want to be able to start the call with your receipts. So the very first place of how you're starting your discovery calls is how you introduce yourself, right? So this is where at the beginning of your discovery call, when you're introducing yourself, you just don't want to say like, hey, I hope you're having a great day. So tell me X, Y, and Z. You actually want to be really clear and intentional with how you're introducing yourself to that lead. And yes, they know about you. They might have read your website or the page or whatever, but this is an opportunity to start the conversation on a strong foot to be able to say, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today. My name's Dr. Erica Jordan Thomas. I'm a former teacher, former principal. I now run a 7-figure education consulting business where we help Black educators grow their impact and wealth through growing 7-figure education consulting businesses. As a teacher, I helped improve student achievement to over 80 to 90% in my classroom. And as a school leader, I helped grow a school to over the top 1% and ranked in our state. And so I'm super excited to learn more about you and how I can help solve your pain point of X, Y, and Z. So imagine starting a conversation there versus, well, how are you doing today? So tell me more about X, Y, and Z. You're starting with who you are and you're positioned yourself as an expert to lead that conversation. Mistake number 2 that I see people making is that the conversation is just way too long. Like this is an initial conversation and people are just taking way too long for the conversation. And oftentimes it's because it's not planned. You're allowing the other person to drive the conversation when the reality is this is your call. You need to be in the driver's seat. You need to be leading the conversation. And so the best practice is that your discovery call should be anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes, no longer than 20 minutes. So if your discovery calls are 30, 40 some minutes, you are not doing something right. Like there's something we needed to tweak. And if you're in the early stage of your business, it may not seem like a big deal But when your business grows and you are having more and more discovery calls, you are actually going to be losing money by taking 30 to 45 minutes for each initial conversation to actually be able to introduce yourself or learn more about the lead. You need to be able to reach your objectives in 15 to 20 minutes. I know we are in the middle of some really good, juicy content, but I wanted to make sure that you knew about my free public Facebook group, which is the opportunity for you to network with other education consultants. Community is so important on your journey, and this is an easy, low-lift way to be able to plug into a community. And so go ahead, click the link below in the show notes to be able to request to join our public free Facebook group so that way you can find your community. Let's get back to the episode. The third misstep that I see people making in their discovery calls is they're just walking into the conversation blind. Like they don't have the level of intel that they should have about their target client. So what ends up happening is they're spending the majority of that conversation learning things about the client versus how they could be serving the client and getting more intel from the target client around things like budget, around what they've tried in the past, to really be able to leave that 15, 20-minute conversation really clear on what service to provide to that client, clear on their potential for a yes to move forward to the proposal. Because I'm not sending out a proposal unless I know you're going to be a yes, right? So that means in that conversation, it's not spent getting to know you. I need to be going into that conversation already having some knowledge around who you are, knowledge around what you do, how you're experiencing this pain point that I can help you solve, such that in the conversation, I'm leveraging that conversation to figure out which service is going to be best for you, not learning more about you. So because of that, the best practice here is you actually want to have a structure in place to do your research prior to the call. And the research could look like spending some time to actually learn more about the person you're having a conversation with or their organization. It could look like them filling out a form or survey before the call, but you need to have some type of prior information about the client such that that conversation can only be 15 or 20 minutes. That's how the conversation becomes efficient and effective, is when you have that information prior to. You should be not walking into a discovery call, not clear on who you're talking to, and just facts about their experience. The fourth big misstep that I see people making in their discovery calls is they're just doing entirely too much talking. Like they are the main ones just sharing and talking. And in education, we have this thing called a teacher talk ratio of how much the teacher is talking versus how much students are talking. And we know that a healthy teacher talk ratio is around 30 to 70, meaning the teacher is doing around 30% of the talking and students are doing 70% of the talking. And that's the same ratio that you want to have in your discovery calls. You want to have the ratio to where the lead is doing the most of the talking versus you doing most of the talking. This is not a presentation. This is not a lecture. This is the time to get deeper into what the other person is experiencing such that you can tailor your proposal and your service to that lead. So that way you're much more likely to get to the finish line of a yes. So when we're talking about who's doing the majority of the talking, it's not you, my friends. It's the other person on the end of the Zoom screen or the phone line. And then the last misstep that I see people making with their discovery calls is after the discovery call, they take entirely too long to follow up. When it comes to the follow-up after a discovery call, and that next step, let's say it might be sending a proposal, I see people who are sending proposals a week later or longer. I hope it's not 2 weeks later. And the problem with sending a proposal a week later or 2 weeks later, again, let's go back to our analogy of a first date. Imagine you go on a first date. It was an amazing experience. You had great time, great conversation. You were connecting and vibing. And then I don't hear from you from another week or 2 weeks. I don't get any communication for 7+ days. I don't even get a good morning text. Like I don't get anything. Like I have now forgotten about you. Like I have moved on, right? That is the same energy and spirit that you're creating when you are taking that long to follow up with your potential lead after the call. And my recommendation and best practice is that after a discovery call, you are sending that next step or proposal within less than 48 hours. because you're still top of mind. The conversation is still fresh for the other person. You're still engaged. We're on a first date. So in the next 48 hours, I'm sending that next text, that next conversation. I'm initiating that next move. And so your timeline following the discovery call conversation should be less than 48 hours from when you're taking that next step to a proposal or whatever it is in your sales process. Taking longer than that is compromising your sales process and your client or potential client actually being positioned to make a decision to say yes, because now I'm no longer excited, right? Now it's been too long since the first date. I don't forgot the first date. I forgot the little butterflies I was feeling in my tummy, right? I've moved on. Those are the big mistakes that I see people making in their discovery call process, as well as 5 best practices to help ensure that you're not making those same mistakes. So let me know what you got from this episode in the comments. Which of these mistakes felt like I might have read you a little bit? You know, it's okay. The truth might hurt. And once we know better, we can do better. So let me know which of these mistakes really felt meaningful for you and which best practice you're most excited to be able to execute in your business. And if you found this episode to be helpful, I want you to share it with a friend and hit the subscribe button so that way you know when the next episode drops. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the 7 Figure Educator Podcast, and I'll see you next time.